the third event in a seminar series called Reimagine Development. The purpose of these seminars is to deepen the conversation about the future of development and explore how we can reimagine the ways in which we address the major challenges of our time. I am Susanna Gable, Chief Economist at Sida, and I will be moderating this seminar. A few technical notes. The webinar will be recorded and shared after the event. We only have 40 minutes for this armchair conversation, so unfortunately we don't have time allocated for a separate question and answer section. Instead, we encourage you to share your reflections, experiences, and questions in the chat box. And I will do my best to weave them into the conversation as we go along. But please know that chat conversation has a value in itself, and we will certainly look closer at it after the event. Another way to communicate is, of course, through Twitter, and please use the hashtag Reimagining Development. 2020, looking backwards from the beginning of 2020, we saw a fantastic trend of poverty reduction where developing countries were finally catching up with the richer countries. Not everything was going in the right direction, of course, but we had Agenda 2030 and the financing for development that broadened the goals for international development cooperation and the key actors involved, and with that, the resource flows necessary for sustainable development. So development organizations and development aid was part of a bigger system, and we had all agreed that we need the whole system to work for sustainable development to happen. Then came COVID by the end of 2020, and we saw actually global poverty numbers increase. So COVID became this massive stress test to the system and put the limelight on many of the key challenges that we are facing. So today, we will be talking about what we learned from this stress test. What do we actually want to very quickly come back to? What was absolutely not working? And in what ways do we need more fundamentally change the way we're working within international development? But without further ado, I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers for this armchair conversation. We have Olsson Fridh, the Swedish Minister for International Development Cooperation. And we have Achim Steiner, the administrator or head of UNDP. I will start with you, Minister Per. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And my first question is really, what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you think about the future of development, or even what comes to your heart when you think about it? So, what emotion? Is it hope? Is it fear? Please, Per.
Well, it's both hope and fear, I should say. And Susanna, it's great to be here. I should say that. I should start with that. It's fantastic to be able to join a conversation with you and Achim on this important topic. I think both hope and fears, and maybe to sum them up, to say tipping points. I'm increasingly scared of the fact that we are in a very fast pace reaching tipping points that are irreversible in terms of climate change or biodiversity degradation, but also social or more, tipping points in our social webs, in terms of poverty, in terms of gender inequality, inequalities, but hopes that maybe we can reverse them and create positive tipping points, where we actually have the planet and people building a positive development in a more effective way with some tipping points. Let's see if we can come back to that maybe during this conversation.
Wonderful. And Achim, wonderful to have you here too. I have the same question to you. What the first thing that comes to your mind and heart? Do you also have these both the fear part and the hope part when you look into the future?
Hi, Susanna. Hello, Per. Great to join you. And having just sat here worrying about the digital connection, let me start with perhaps one element of fear and hope, which is digital disruption. I think we live in an era where we have just learned and appreciated what technology can provide and what it means not to have access to technology, but not in a sense defining the whole future of development, but it's emblematic of something that I think is happening to us and that we are part of making happen, and that is disruption, profound disruption, radical uncertainties emerging. And I think to me, the most important thing to emerge from that is choices. This is a moment, this is a generation, this is also a field of cooperation, development cooperation, in which the choices we make over the next few weeks, over the next few months, and the next few years will literally matter for years, for decades, and even generations to come. So I, in a sense, have a sense of trepidation. I think we have really looked into a very deep hole, a dark hole over the last 12, 15 months. But I see also an extraordinary moment of opportunity. And I think that is what Per and I think both sense is the challenge of our time.
Yeah, and just continuing on the digital part that you were talking about, which is maybe much connected to the hope side of things. But you were also mentioning that there is big disruptions and that it almost sounds like we're talking about more of a paradigm shift rather than just marginal changes at this point. Do you think that we're operating too much still in this old paradigm that we had? Are we still investing in CDs when we should be investing in Spotify, so to speak? Are we looking backwards at evidence when we design our intervention within education, rather than thinking we should leapfrog and see what opportunities there are to connect to online high quality classes that everyone can access, and it's the digital divide that we should address instead? Just as an example, should we just think very differently, radically differently than we do today? Achim, if you want to continue.
If you're asking me, absolutely. And I think it is what what we have learned also out of a long Confucian tradition of philosophy, also that famous adage that every crisis is an opportunity. And this is not just a prosaic statement. This is what history has taught us. Disruption, crises are both traumatic, but they also in some sense liberate. And I think right now, in the midst of this pandemic, we should not try to, confuse that with unwarranted optimism, but rather to sharpen our thinking, our understanding of what will matter about the next few years. Are we going to use this as a pivot point, for instance, to address something that is so glaringly obvious right now and is perfectly addressable? If you are not digitally connected in the next few years, you will be left behind as never before, because the difference between those who have access to digital connectivity, to broadband, will change their opportunities, their ability to act, to exercise agency profoundly. And this is not a techno-fetishism, it is simply a recognition that you can see in the eyes and the experiences and the tears often of 1 billion children over the last year. If your parents were wealthy enough, if you lived in a neighborhood or in a country where you could have access to broadband, you could still connect, not only to your friends, but to an educational system. If you did not have that connectivity, you lost a year of education, and the stories go on. And I think what you refer to as a paradigm shift or a paradigm change is another way of saying what we do next cannot simply be something that we derive by looking in the rearview mirror. There are lessons we have learned. development is all about choices, whether you are Sweden or whether you are, a small country, maybe somewhere on the continent of Africa, or you're a large economy somewhere in Latin America. Choices matter. And I think what we are clearly recognizing right now is that into this deep disruption we are experiencing, there is another phenomenon that is emerging. And that is the recognition that systemic approaches are needed. We are literally affecting, as humans today, the life support systems of our planet. Living in the age of the Anthropocene, as the Human Development Report put it, is a profoundly vital recognition that the actions we take do not affect only ourselves, our neighbors, our neighborhood, a geography. They have planetary consequences. So thinking into the future, we are the generation, literally the generation, not one or three or four, the generation that will decide whether our children even have the possibility of doing something about global warming, climate change, 1.5 degrees anymore. The next 10 years will either lock us in for hundreds of years or put us on a different trajectory. And so here, I think, lies one of the key challenges. How do we overcome the inertia that is embedded in our systems, in our economies? And I'm sure we'll talk more about it in a moment. And I'd love to listen to Per, because disruption is profoundly unsettling. Disruption is profoundly liberating if we are clear about the choices we need to make, and we can create a sense of common purpose, of shared purpose in making those choices. Because, the choice right now for a wealthier country is, let's vaccinate ourselves first, then we'll worry about the rest. The choice is also, let's think about the whole world and then figure out how we can make this work for everyone, because otherwise it won't work for us either. Classic dilemma. And economists, philosophers, politicians, everybody is struggling with it. And I think we have to, provide inspiration, answers, opportunities.
What do you think, Per? Are we at this tipping point where we can actually gather and together in a positive and filled with energy into the future?
Well, I think Achim is right. We had, Susanna, in your introduction, you talked about that we had done a lot of development gains leading up to 2020 on lifting hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty as one example. But that period, when we think about development as something we succeeded with, also created large inequalities in our world. It created cracks, and where there's a crack, light comes in. And this pandemic has been that light, and it has revealed the cracks in our global society, you could say. We had a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis already before the pandemic. We had a hunger crisis before the pandemic. We had inequalities before the pandemic. The pandemic has then come, and we now have a health crisis, and its consequences are, of course, devastating, with job losses and shutdown and lockdowns and socioeconomic stress. So what we do know is that the way we used to operate brought us here. So we need now to find a new modus operandi. We need to find a new way of not only reimagining development, but rethinking how this world should be structured and how development could work. And I think we need to find these also integrated solutions that can target many of these different things that are needed to create those, again, positive tipping points where development can drive itself in more of the right direction. So technology, internet connection is definitely one of them. I think, of course, climate is another one. The global economy, or the recovery that we now need to work for globally. I mean, that global economy needs to be a climate economy. There's really no way to escape that. Climate will be the defining factor for society in a long way to come. It goes for governments, for private sector, for societies, and therefore that needs to be somehow the start. If we can redefine our relationship with nature, if we can get on track with climate action, it will be a lot easier for us also to tackle many of the socioeconomic challenges that we have. But again, finding integrated solutions, it's easy to say, but I'm sure Achim can agree with me, not so easy to find and to roll out, because we are used to see things and structure the world in silos. And as a development minister, I can see that our financing flows are also structured in silos. So again, we need to rethink and reimagine. I mean, the way out of this position that we're in now is not limited to what we know, but it's limited to what we can imagine for tomorrow. So we need to be brave, and we need to be ready for quite brave decisions and determination, both politically and financially, to get this rolling in the right direction.
So you both talk a lot about that we need to look at today's problems from a holistic, multidimensional point of view. Is there a chance that by broadening this agenda, as we have and we have all agreed on with Agenda 2030, that the goals as before, such as eliminating poverty reduction, will put a little bit on the side? How do we ensure that we don't leave people living in poverty or the poor countries behind when we have broadened the agenda and have other goals goals, such as climate goals and others. Per, do you want to continue on that one?
Well, I think it's a fair question to put, but I also think that to have, you know, to drive climate action within development is not driving for poverty targets. This is a drive. Climate change is definitely a driver for poverty. So they are not either or, and I think this is where we need to come to a conclusion. The big question is, how do we program interventions so that we target both people that are living in poverty and their circumstances, such as their environment or climate. I think also perhaps that one other aspect that we need to discuss more is trust and trust building. I think this world is increasingly, we have a lack of trust between people and institutions, between governments, and so on. And trust is a long-term project. So that needs to be built from the bottom up, I think. And I think maybe that could be an answer to your question. How do we make sure that we don't leave people behind? How do we make sure that we have people with us in this development direction? Well, we need to start with people. We need to ask them what their life is, what they want to change in their life, and how that could be changed. And from those answers, build this transformative change. No one can change on their own. So we need to better the circumstances for individuals, for families, for groups, societies. But without, development is not in a vacuum. I mean, so we need also to have this broader perspective to create that environment where change can happen.
I wanted to ask you also, Achim, this question, and I think this trust aspect is very important. So maybe we can come back to that. But so there's two sides. If you broaden all the goals, but also broaden the resource flows to solve these goals, you don't necessarily need to make that sharp trade-offs. So if you could also comment on the increased number of resource flows when you look into the future, is it possible to reach all these broadened goals if we can have more actors gather behind them? Achim.
Also, now let me challenge perhaps two things, and not because I think we fundamentally disagree, but the way we frame the conversation. First of all, have the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, by broadening out the 17 goals, diminished our attention and impact on poverty reduction? I would challenge that head on, because I think that part of the world that has not being able to reduce poverty was already not reducing it before. Poverty reduction happens, out of a very deliberate set of choices. I mean, as Per said, a society can choose that, there is a degree of poverty we accept in order for the rest of us to be wealthy, or, they come later, first comes this, urban, rural. I mean, there are many ways in which you can leave people behind in a society. But the fact is that we have seen extraordinary poverty reduction progress in, first of all, the last 300 years. Remember, 9 out of 10 people alive in the 1800s lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 1 in 10. So we've reversed that, first of all. That's an extraordinary story of development. But persistent poverty is there. COVID is essentially a risk that we will actually end up with more than 1 billion people living in extreme poverty again by 2030 if we don't act very deliberately on poverty reduction. So my point is, I don't think the SDGs have diminished attention. I think what they have actually opened up is an extraordinary opportunity, because you can't essentially eradicate poverty by just eradicating poverty. You can't give somebody a sort of medicine, a prescription, say, I'm going to, make you not poor now. You have to build economic systems. You have to build social protection systems, social safety nets, because many of the people, for instance, who escape extreme poverty and actually get out of that situation fall back into poverty again, for example, because of their vulnerability in healthcare. There is no health insurance for many people around the world. When your father, your mother, your daughter falls ill, your entire savings have to be spent on saving them. So we have an extraordinary falling back into poverty. And so we need to build health safety systems, social protection systems. And what the SDGs have essentially also signaled is we've got to stop looking for these silver bullets. You need to build an economy that is inclusive. That's what will reduce poverty, not having a poverty eradication program standing on its own. You have to change the way that we look at taxation systems, for instance, that continue to favor, for instance, fossil fuel subsidies right now, at the expense of actually taxing labor. When we need jobs, we're actually making labor more expensive because our income in public government systems is largely dependent on income taxes, for example, as a significant part. So there is a significant need to shift the way we tax ourselves in societies in order to be able to address the investment agenda, the social protection agenda, and so on. And just to go on something very particular, since Per, you spoke about climate change. So one part of the world looks at energy right now as a problem, namely our energy infrastructure, our carbon footprint is taking us to the precipice. Another part of the world is looking at energy as essentially the fundamental shortcut to being able to make progress, because they don't have access to electricity even today. 600 million people on the African continent have not yet had the opportunity to leverage power as a way of accelerating development. Now, what the SDGs are saying is, look, you can both work in isolation. On one hand, we're going to build more coal-fired power stations on the African continent, fossil fuel, high carbon emitting infrastructure, essentially replicating the energy system of Europe or North America of the 20th century. While, in Europe, we maybe are looking at the rest of the world, some of the larger developing economies, and are saying, well, they've got to do something first because, they're now so large with their populations that if we reduce our carbon footprint, nothing will change. This is a recipe for disaster. This is a dead end in the way we look at development. So energy right now with the SDGs becomes actually an opportunity. One, we need to decarbonize existing infrastructure quite clearly. At the same time, we need to co-invest in developing an energy infrastructure, for instance, on the African continent, that can cater to 2 billion people by 2050, is low carbon, and provides an extraordinary impulse for development. So suddenly the climate change conundrum becomes not one of contrarian interest. They're not acting, we're not acting. They're not doing enough, so we're not going to do more. They want our money, why don't they pay for it themselves? This is where the future of development right now has to reinvent itself. Unless we can use the SDGs to illustrate that this is a co-investment rationale, we are going to fail. Neither the developing world has the resources, nor the developed world, quite frankly, to buy itself free of some of these challenges we face. So instead of looking at aid as some transfer in the old tradition of solidarity or maybe compassion. It's a much more powerful way to understand that if we co-invest in Africa's ability to power its economies right now with clean, renewable energy technology, these are the markets into which we will export. That will keep the Paris Agreement alive. And frankly, without it, everything we're doing at home becomes a little bit redundant. And this is the larger picture. So I have a very strong plea to embrace the SDGs because they are essentially our agenda of our time. We have lost the opportunity to simply solve problems one by one. We need to see systemic connections, and suddenly acting on climate change becomes, with the same dollar, the same euro, the same yen, an investment also in poverty reduction, because power does reduce poverty, in cleaner energy, and so on.
Wonderful. I think it's important to think of poverty reduction not only as ensuring that people that today are poor can move out of poverty, but it's also about preventing people from falling into poverty. So it's the current poor and it's the future poor. And with that approach, it becomes very obvious that we also need to care about those that will fall into poverty in the future due to climate change and all other aspects of the SDG agenda. But Per, I wanted to continue a little bit on what Achim was just talking about, that we are all part of the same system, and if you would like, the self-interest motive of aid that's there too. We see more and more countries donor countries that at home have pressure of explaining aid more in, okay, how does it serve us as a country? And maybe we sit very comfortable when we talk about climate change and preventing pandemics and things like that, but there is also this more bilateral self-interest in that it can promote our investments and so on. How do you explain all that to your taxpayers?
Well, I think, clearly, if you want to start from the very narrow self-interest, we all need a world that is more secure, where we feel that we can trust that tomorrow will be better than yesterday. And what we've learned from the pandemic, for example, is that something that starts in another local context on another side of the planet very fast becomes also a problem that hits our societies as hard. So therefore, to work together for a common good, for common development, common security is in the self-interest of everyone. Solidarity always has two sides. One is that you share with someone else and they benefit from it. But the other side of that coin is that you yourself will also have a lot better circumstances by sharing. But I'd also like to answer that question in another way. I think we're currently faced with what could be termed as a triple health, economic, planetary crisis. Now, these three terms, the pandemic, the health crisis that we have, it's clearly global. It doesn't show, yes, the pandemic does hit the most vulnerable worst, but the virus hits everyone more or less the same. And it has shown us that if we don't build robust health systems and a global health security system in one way or the other, this will come back. And we need to fight this pandemic for countries to open up democratically and economically and be part of a global recovery that could meet this economic part of this triple crisis. Now, this economic part, of course, is what Achim discussed or referred earlier to, that an economy that is more inclusive, more equal, more gender equal, more sustainable than before, where we reach people that didn't before was part of the markets or the economy in different ways. And I think access to energy is one of the clearly most evidently things that we need to work on here. But of course, the economy is completely global. And our economy is dependent on other countries' economy, because otherwise we can't trade with each other. And we need that. We need that for our value chains, we need it for our food chains, and so on and so forth. And the planetary crisis pretty much goes without saying. The climate crisis, the degradation of biodiversity is not happening somewhere else. It's everywhere, and it's now. And again, reaching tipping points where they are irreversible. So when the glaciers are melting, when the Arctic ice is melting, when the Amazon is deforested, when the fresh water is being more and more salty, when sea rise level comes, the Gulf Stream also changes. And when the Gulf Stream changes, we have a completely different climate also in the Nordic countries. And we won't be as secure, we won't be able to feed our children the way we are used to. And so this all comes together. So I think also when we reimagine development and aid, we are moving from the traditional rich countries give poor countries resources to how can we together work for a more sustainable and secure world where we don't leave anyone behind. And I agree with Achim so much. The Sustainable Development Goals, we are lucky that we made them in 2015 because they are now the roadmap out of this crisis and the way into this new world that we now need to rebuild.
It's certainly a good framework to fall back on when we so clearly during the crisis saw that it's a multi-dimensional cushion that needs to be there to get through crises like the pandemic. So many of the challenges that you describe is global in nature and that need global solutions. We see poverty being more and more concentrated in very difficult environments, fragile environments in many dimensions, but not least in the conflict dimension. And obviously, when we need cross country solutions, the multilateral system becomes central. And that showed also during this crisis. Achim, how do you see the donor dynamics right now? We would expect after a pandemic like this that the support to the multilateral system would be higher than ever. What's your thought on this?
Did step up. I mean, we've seen, whether it was in the context of the international financial system, the debt suspension sustainability initiative, now with the IMF, the special drawing rights. I mean, there is, first of all, a recognition how central it is to apply basically the same logic we're applying in our own countries to a global economy. I mean, if we don't stabilize, if we don't provide stimulus packages, if we don't reduce the risk of debt defaults, we are going to have deep trouble ahead of us. So I think the first response, although inadequate, given the scale of the crisis, certainly showed that we needed those international institutions, and yet we also found them wanting sometimes. But let me bring the discussion down to where maybe in a street in Stockholm, you might walk up to somebody and say, you think we should be funding the United Nations? You think we should be sending money, to some country in Africa? And my first question would be then to that person, how do you think the situation will look 5 years down the line if we simply, stopped supporting these countries? Do you think there would be less wars, less economic crisis, less refugees, less internally displaced people? And I think we could even, with all differences in maybe ideological or political terms, agree that it's hardly going to get better if there is no support from the international community. And so I think the first thing we have to reestablish is an appreciation amongst our own citizens that, there is a very powerful logic that binds us together. And I think it goes beyond even the notion of self-interest. I want to build on Per's point. I think it is about common purpose and shared interest. You know, we often try, and economists, Susanna, I'm also one, you're one, but our profession has sometimes been very culpable of trying to explain human psychology and human behavior, including economic behavior, as ultimately only rational because it's in the self-interest. I mean, history has taught us so often how wrong this is. Sometimes the poorest people are amongst the most generous in helping refugees, in helping people in crisis. This logic simply doesn't hold, and yet economic rules, models, and policies have been built around this notion of selfishness. I think in our societies we need to rediscover, first of all, a degree of open-mindedness to understanding where the world is today. And our interdependence is significantly higher than it was even 15, 20 years ago, not just because of climate, cybercrime, crises, conflict, refugees, economic implosion. These are all factors that affect us, even though we might be living 5,000 miles away. Secondly, I think what is critical is that we also perhaps reestablish an understanding and a sense of trust that how does a Swedish citizen connect to a conflict such as Yemen? It is the multilateral system that allows us to come together, because Sweden sending a lot of Swedish people and all its Swedish resources to Yemen wouldn't be able to either stop the conflict or even cope with the significant humanitarian crisis that is there. You combine your forces, suddenly a country such as Sweden with 20 others allows us to make almost impossible situations become possible to act on. So there is a simple numbers logic here of why we need the multilateral system. Secondly, it is also a way in which we can learn to work together despite our differences. You know, I often invoke this notion that we didn't set up the United Nations because nations are united. No, we are a world full of divisions, full of differences. They might be cultural, economic, political, historical. But where else in the world have we got a place where every country has a seat in this whole of the General Assembly? It's not the power of your economy that defines your right to be heard. That principle alone should make every Swedish citizen feel proud of its role that it has played in setting up the United Nations. Now, I work in it, and let me be very frank, perfection is not what I would profess our system to represent. We are sometimes bureaucratic. We fail. We have failed in stopping wars. We sometimes are unable to respond to also the criticisms that are legitimate. But you know, the kind of negativity that has begun to create, even in Swedish society and other countries, a sort of polarization, a division in the political arena that starts questioning whether one should even engage in multilateralism, whether one should think about development investments as being something that is rational for Sweden to do. That is deeply troubling. And from that point of view, I think, Susanna, yes, we are in a troubled moment. And I think I always say this is also a failure on my part, on our part, to be able to reconnect where people have developed deep doubts. In part, they're also fanned by, you know, the cheap negative headline. I mean, one failure is blown up into a catastrophic event. The fact that 1,000 other actions that day took place that saved, for example, today, 100 million people from starvation. How many Swedish people know that the World Food Programme, the humanitarian community, the NGOs together are literally providing food to roughly 100 million people today? Nobody ever writes about that. Nobody takes note of the fact that this is almost a given, and yet it takes people who haven't left countries like Yemen in the middle of the pandemic. We have hundreds of UN staff colleagues working there, stuck there, sometimes not even being able to have medical treatment for COVID because we can't get the medicines in and get them out. This is the service of the United Nations in the name of this idea of the United Nations. So I'm a great fan of going out to the streets and not be defensive about the criticisms, but also redefine a discussion in Sweden about what is multilateralism all about and who are we as Swedes in the year 2021 when we look at the future of the world. And just to end on one small anecdote, we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Many politicians said, are you crazy? People will never understand the 17 goals, far too complicated. Well, the simple answer is, take a look at your evening news. We live in a complicated world. this is a complex moment in history. And these goals, if you just turn them around, are actually the great risks of our time that we agreed we can actually only tackle together. And this is, as Per said, the extraordinary thing about this 2030 agenda. We actually agreed on the great risks to our future. We did so with 193 countries. And yes, we'll interpret them differently, we'll prioritize them differently. But show me anything else that is more powerful right now to allow us even to talk to each other about where we need to act together. And there is, in my mind, nothing that compares to the Sustainable Development Goals.
I think
can I build on that?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think Achim is very right here, and no one can reach a tipping point on their own. Coming back to my hope that we will reach positive tipping points in development. So no one can reach them on their own. No country can do so, and every target within the SDGs need the other targets to become their tipping point. But we also need here other sectors, and the Secretary General he speaks now about the networked multilateralism. That multilateralism in the 2020s is not only countries coming together to work in the UN programs, but it's also private sector, it's civil society, and it's community-based organizations. And I think this is a very good thought also, that we now need all actors to come together and work with the Sustainable Development Goals as a common objective. And again, when we reimagine development, what role does development then play? Because we know that even if all countries in the world would do like Sweden and give 1% of GNI to ODA, we wouldn't fill all the pockets of needs that are out there. So we need, of course, to walk that first mile to make sure that positive tipping point can start to happen. And we might need to walk that last mile with development so that we reach those furthest left behind. But we need to make sure that other investment, additional funding and other types of funding streams and work streams also work in this direction. Because otherwise, we can continue to do everything right within development. But if we don't have other sectors, if we don't have other streams working aligned, then this development is not going to be sustainable. So to de-risk, to motivate, to direct additional investments and funding also in the direction of climate action, of investing in biodiversity, of poverty reduction, in health and education, making sure that girls and women are part of this positive development, investing in trust, investing in inclusive societies. I mean, everyone needs to be walking that aisle, because in the end of that aisle, things will look different. And I think to paint that picture and bring everyone with us, that's when we have a chance. That's when we can create those tipping points and development can start drive itself towards the end where we want to have it.
Wonderful. I like this conversation about trust, and maybe we can stay here for a little bit. I just got a green light that we can continue for a few more minutes. So we talk a lot about the trust as a necessity for on a global level, in the sense that not least because we can't trace every single tax dollar and say exactly what it has been used for, and we need this very agile way of working with more like core support and so on. If we're going to be able to act very quickly in pandemics and other crises and very difficult context. But we also have trust within our partner countries that is also important to support in their development. And not least tested then during the pandemic. And a part of that system and that social contract, so to speak, that you build up between citizens, the state, and the businesses that needs to work in a sustainable society, is strengthened by institutions such as you have good domestic resource mobilization and taxation, but people also feel that they get something from it. It could be social protection. It could be the company sees that roads are being built and so on and so on. Staying at social protection, that was one of the bigger expansions during COVID. Do you see that as something that will stay as a core for the development going further, as building a more resilient society, and as a key to this trust that you both talked about being so important? Achim, do you want to start commenting on that?
Sorry, Susanna, did you say you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, I think what you just touched on is extremely important. I mean, social contract is both a generic term, but in the minds of some also then defined by very specific elements of the contract. I think as the United Nations Development Programme, I think there is a long tradition and a recognition that governance matters. We have always been an institution that has viewed itself not as just a deliverer of a technical assistance input, but in fact what we're trying to do is help build the governance capacity of countries. And whether you call it a social contract or good governance and anti-corruption, democracy, I mean, these are all elements that feed into this. But I think it's important to recognize that, for many younger nations, building that governance infrastructure, but also governance consensus is critical. And in the midst of this pandemic, to your question, we very early on realized that we had to focus UNDP's work both on helping countries manage the crisis, but also on how to, as we call it, build forward better. Namely, out of the crisis with these significant investments, these significant wounds in society and Achilles heels and traumatic situations, how do you begin to invest also in coming out of this crisis with something that people can believe in more? Because one of the big lessons that we learned in COVID-19 experiences across the world is where the people trust their leaders, their government, there was actually a much more effective capacity to respond to the crisis, sometimes more significant than the financial and economic might to do so. And we therefore in UNDP very quickly homed in on 4 areas where countries were looking to accelerate that evolution of a social contract out of COVID-19. Governance was a key area, sometimes fundamental human rights. We've seen the big debates in societies across the world about the rule of law. How does constitutional law and the fundamental rights of citizens coexist with the need for a lockdown? Secondly, we saw also the significance of social protection systems and the free fall in which literally hundreds of millions of people found themselves. So UNDP is very much focused on helping countries look at social protection, social safety, from the temporary basic income to looking at multidimensional poverty, not just income per household, in order to better allow countries to put in place the system that leaves fewer people behind. Thirdly, the green recovery. I think it is no coincidence that, the growing discomfort with climate change, the realization that it is now happening and we are close to losing the ability to actually do something about it, has made green recovery a central part of the DNA of coming out of this crisis. And then digital. I think these are just 4 areas in which we both have a possibility to drive economic development and recovery, but actually also to build a social contract, because all 4 of them will either divide us by failure or unite us by a sense of trust that actually our state institutions, our political systems are able to respond to where people are actually wanting to set priorities. Now, in very basic terms, that does mean the social contract will look different as we move forward. But I think we also need to be careful, and this is sometimes a debate that I have also, particularly with countries in our donor community, that we need to focus on the social contract, empower countries to define and develop their social contracts. We don't have the right to tell them what their social contract should be. That's where partnership begins and ends. And I think there is always going to be a positive tension if managed well, or a negative tension if we become patronizing or we become judgmental to the point where we assume that my model is the only model. And I think this is one of the challenges of our time also coming out of COVID, because there are very different responses, very different realities, and very different social contracts emerging.
Per, also to you, how do you see the social trust playing a part in this green transformation that we see in front of us?
Well, Susanna, I'm not like you and Achim, an economist, but a sociologist is my educational background. So I very much believe in this idea of a social contract, or actually, I see society more as a weave, that you weave. We weave it every day together, and that connects us in different ways to one another, and we create a larger understanding then of how this world and the ecosystem or the social system that we're put in. I think trust is a key factor for a green transition, because climate change makes us worried and vulnerable, or vulnerable and worried, I'd say, for what happens tomorrow. But what the green transition does is also scary, because it will be another type of jobs, another job market. It will be other solutions than the solutions that we had. And we don't know if those solutions, am I fit for those solutions? Do I have a part to play in that transition? And of course, we need to build trust to have people trust in that if this green, or if this economic recovery becomes the green transition that we need, I will have a share of that economy. We need to start with trust and ask people on their levels, what do you suffer from? What do you need? What do you want? And how can we help create that so that you also can take your part in this transition, so you can have your share of this economic recovery? And let's not do the mistakes of yesterday. Let's not increase inequalities when we do economic development, but let's reduce them. Let's grow and expand the democratic space, the social space. Let's include more people in the economy, and let's make sure that the economy drives that green transition, so that we can leave this planet in the hands of our children and grandchildren in a bit better shape than it is at this moment. And I'm afraid sometimes when I wake up that that's too late, that those those tipping points are getting too close. But I don't sit in this chair because I want to give up on them. I sit here because I am convinced that if we are enough people who are willing to do our share for that type of development, we can change it and we can reach those positive tipping points instead. And so that's how I think about it. But I agree with Achim. I mean, we must understand that we have come together. We are on this planet, not because we are all alike, but we are sharing the same value and the same dignities, but we are not alike and our systems won't be the same. But we need to find a way to work together for an inclusive, equal, gender equal, sustainable recovery from this pandemic, so that we don't come into a loop where these pandemics happen more and more often, but rather the opposite. We can protect ourselves and find therefore a more secure world, a sustainable world, and come to ease with our relation with nature. And I think it comes down to trust, to have people that are willing to march with us in that direction.
Wonderful. I think it's a very productive approach to think about building trust as how people not only can benefit from development but also contribute to it. And I don't just mean that in an economic sense, but in all dimensions of development. We will have to wrap up very soon. I'd like your very short key takeaways, or what we should take from this discussion, starting with you, Achim. What's your main message?
Well, in part, ours was to be an armchair conversation about the future of development. So let me perhaps address what I sometimes consider also to be armchair critics, which is if we accept some of the things that we took as premise today, greater uncertainty, we need to shift, change, transform, and the vocabulary of our moment in time is very revealing. I also want to try to have UNDP become an institution that can convey to the public that ultimately supports us, whether in the countries that we call program countries whom we work with directly, the countries that support us with their taxpayers' money, that we need to also embrace the paradigm of innovation. It's very strange because people celebrate in the tech sphere today the startup world as the ultimate illustration of, entrepreneurship, innovation, dynamism. I took that very seriously when I became the head of UNDP. The first thing I tried to understand is how do I make UNDP a 21st century organization with my team? Where do I insert new ways of working? And one area clearly was in understanding how innovation could drive what we do and how we do things differently. So we launched initially 60, now 91 accelerator labs. They are essentially teams embedded in our country teams to give us collectively, they're not, the small cast of people who have seen the future, but they have created the capacity for us to do two things. Go to where people are actually inventing their lives every day and learn from them how you manage systems. It's changing the eyes of our organization to be a smart development partner. And secondly, also to try and bring a way of thinking about development that has a lot to do with the future. Because, often our development discussions, including in the public, is always about the past. The failures of the past, the legacies of the past, when actually development in truth, the way you and I would think about it when we sit around our families or maybe in our organizations, is all about the future. So it's also to create within an organization like UNDP the capacity to engage with those who are working at the cutting edge of technology, of behavioral science, of inclusive finance, of gender disaggregated data collection so that we can target young girls in the educational system. We can understand what STEM, science, technology, etc., need in terms of promotion. So my plea is, if we think about the future of development, first of all, I think we covered some very interesting ground today. Secondly, a very strong plea that development cooperation is not an anachronism. It's not dead. Development aid in the traditional sense, I think, is increasingly less relevant, not redundant, because there are situations where aid is a matter of survival, but it's actually about investing in the future. And the day that the wealthiest nations of the world do not recognize the returns on their investment in their common future is probably the day where we will fall apart as a global community. And we sometimes are coming close to that point. So development cooperation, the philosophy of working together, fundamental to our moment in time. And I hope many who perhaps followed us today in this discussion will carry this debate into their communities, because we need to have it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Achim. And Per, your key takeaways.
I think, first of all, it's been a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and it's always is to have this type of discussions with Achim. I think my key takeaway is that we are now in a key moment where we can either choose, and I like how Achim has put emphasis on our choices. We can either choose to embrace what we know, to make use of all the tools that we have, that we've tried in different contexts, that we can scale up those small-scale solutions that has worked for us, and find this integrated working methods pushing us, driving us forward. We can either choose to do so now to handle this pandemic, to handle the recovery in a way where we reach this positive and inclusive development, sustainable development, or we don't. And if we don't invest in that, then we will leave this pandemic behind eventually, or perhaps not even everywhere. We'll still have pockets of COVID damaging people's lives. and with increased inequalities, increased poverty, and with continued degradation of our livelihoods and of this planet. To me, that choice is very easy. To increase our cooperation, not to step back and hide, not to point at anyone else, but to step up, to step forward and say, look, this world is ours and this planet is the only one we have. And we, the peoples, need to take these important steps forward, and we can only do so together. And I think this is the moment where we need to make that choice. And I'm happy. My prime minister has initiated this UN at 75 cooperation with many more countries in this world, stepping up for multilateralism, for global cooperation, and for us to do things together. We stand up, we stand firm behind our 1% target of GNI to ODA. So Sweden is ready to play this part. But again, we ourselves alone cannot create this tipping point that we search for. UNDP, with all its power, all its knowledge, all its staff around the world, cannot create this tipping point solely on their own. But we need united nations to do so, and we need other sectors to be aligned and compliant with the Paris Treaty, with the SDGs, and the outcomes of the coming Conference of the Parties on Biodiversity as well. And if we can create that massive movement of actors, I'm sure we can reach where we want.
What a fantastic ending. On behalf of UNDP Sweden, I'd like to thank you profoundly, Minister and Administrator, and everyone participating. Have a wonderful rest of the day or night. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you so much.